Now I'm going to introduce somebody who is really important to me. He's my professor, and one sec. So, he is known as Prince Albert III, affectionately also known as Prince the Culture Keeper. He's a human rights advocate, a professor of law and world cultures, and an award-winning multidisciplinary artist. For over a decade, Professor Albert served as the Technology Policy Council for Civil Rights, Human Rights, and Consumer Rights organizations in DC. And in 2018, he founded Goldwater Ventures, a strategic advisory firm that equips mission-driven companies to deploy emerging technologies to promote human rights. In 2025, Professor Albert founded the Culture Keepers Circle, this is something I'm passionate about, a national grassroots initiative to monitor billions of cultural resources in federal US custody. And he teaches the first cultural sustainability law course here at Georgetown University Law, which 3 of us were in that class. So if we could all give a round up for Professor Prince Albert III.
Thank you, Jackie. Peace and blessing, Panhanachila Nishia evening. Peace and blessings to all my colleagues and honored guests here this evening. I extend gratitude to the Georgetown African Law Society and the Georgetown African Business Alliance and the organization Afrika for hosting Africa Day 2026. Give them a round of applause. To my former students, it won't be another lecture that you've ever heard before. But I ask the question, what is Africa? Most people would say that it's obviously a continent. Or is it? What about Madagascar, Cape Verde, Seychelles, and its 115 islands? More than 3,000 islands extending into the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans are attributed to the continent of Africa. So even Africa as a contiguous geographic entity gets complicated very quickly. Some scholars define Africa culturally, focusing on linguistic connections and ethnic migrations that transcend today's geopolitical borders. Today, Africa is home to more than 3,000 distinct ethnic groups and more than 2,000 living languages. How can 3,000 different ethnic groups be one? Cultural scholars like Kwame Anthony Appiah, question whether Africa as a coherent concept is even possible given the continent's massive diversity. Some scholars say Africa is its people, defined by shared histories of migration and dispersal across the world. The continent is home to 1.5 billion people, but there are 180 million people of African descent throughout the Americas like me, more than 25 million in Europe, and 8 million in Asia, including Afro-Iraqis, Afro-Saudis, Afro-Iranians, India's Sidi people, and the Al-Akhdam people of Yemen. And there are 1 million Africans alone in the Chinese city of Guangzhou. Together, we are 1.76 billion children of Africa. 1 in 5 humans on Earth today is, in some sense, African. Other scholars define Africa as a historical unity. Western academia has deliberately distorted Africa's history and erased her contributions to humanity. So Afrocentrists like Drs. Molefi Asante, Ife Amadiume, and Mirimba Ani argue that Africa must be studied, defined, and taught from African perspectives. This is intellectual decolonization. No scholar exemplifies Afrocentrism more powerfully than the legendary Pan-Africanist, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. Dr. Diop proved that Kemet, ancient Egypt, was a black African civilization. He proved it through melanin testing of mummies. He proved it through linguistic analysis connecting Medu-Neter, ancient Egyptian alive today, and Ethiopian Coptic language, linking it to his own mother tongue in Senegal, Wolof. Diop did not theorize Africa's greatness. He unveiled its timeless truth for the world. But now it gets more complicated. Entire schools of thought define an Africa as a philosophical sphere of influence, where we think, emote, and act in brilliant and uniquely African ways. France implemented the colonial policy of assimilation. Assimilation demanded that Africans in its continental and Caribbean collectivities abandon their indigenous languages, cultures, ethnic affiliations, and become de faux français, falsely French. This was cultural annihilation masquerading as civilizing. Aimé Césaire, Léopold Sédar Senghor, Léon Gontran Damas all said no to French assimilation. And in the 1930s, these three Francophone writers founded the movement La Négritude. Negritude was an African way of being and thinking in a cosmopolitan and modern age. A child of Africa could live their Négritude à Paris, à Dakar, au Port-au-Prince, in London, in Cape Town, and even here in Washington, D.C. Anywhere. But now to go even further, this is quite complicated of asking what is Africa. A brave lot of activist scholars dared to will Africa into a whole political existence. Pan-Africanism calls for the solidarity of us, the 1.76 billion people composed of 3,000 ethnicities, 2,000 languages dispersed across 6 continents. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, and one of Pan-Africanism's greatest architects, said plainly, quote, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up to the total liberation of Africa," end quote. That is Pan-Africanism's declaration. In other words, no child of Africa is truly free until all 1.76 billion of us are free. Pan-Africanists like the legendary Sheikh Anta Diop, who I mentioned before, and Julius Nyerere acknowledge that unity of this immense scale does not arise spontaneously. They argue that it must be deliberately constructed and reified with every generation. Pan-Africanism is therefore a declaration of what Africa will become. African institutions and African solutions to world problems. Children of Africa building an Africa together. So Africa is a place, an identity, a shared history, or is it a political project? By show of hands, how many of you say Africa is a place? That's all? Okay. How many of you say it's an identity? Okay. How many of you share it is say it's a shared history? About the same. And how many of you say it's a political project? Okay. Okay. In typical law school fashion, I would say that I believe Africa is all the above and something else entirely. I posit that Africa has been a geographic reality, encompassing a kaleidoscope of cultures, languages, and peoples who have always influenced one another. Colonization and forced dispersal have exponentially and eternally expanded Greater Africa into an unbound reality across space and time. And therefore, Africa is now a global galaxy of millions of cultural communities influencing each other across every continent, collectively willing Africa into being. Thus, Pan-Africanism is kind of onto something. Essentially, Africa is the community her children choose to build together. Okay, now that we've reified and redefined what Africa is, what does it mean to be African? To be African, to participate in the project of becoming Africa, wherever you find yourself in the world, encompasses three things: color, consciousness, and commitment. Now repeat after me, say color.
Color.
More than that, y'all. Say color.
Color.
Okay. Color is the first pillar of African identity in practice. Color refers to genealogical and aesthetic connection, not phenotype. Colorism will never define us. But blackness is interesting to examine here. Both Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe and Jamaican-born philosopher Sylvia Wynter both trace how the racialization of Africans as black justified their dehumanization and dispossession. Wynter, Mbembe, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, W.B. Du Bois, Bell Hooks, and even my own scholarly work answers this in unison, declaring that blackness is a reclamation, a vindication of racialized African being. Blackness is the means by which we, African-descended peoples, took a racial category imposed upon us to destroy our humanity and transformed it into the living proof that our humanity is inextinguishable. Color means the genealogy we carry inside of us and the color-coded ways we express ourselves outwardly as children of Africa, regardless of where we are born. Now say consciousness.
Consciousness.
Come on now, consciousness.
Consciousness.
Consciousness is the second pillar of African identity in practice. Consciousness means knowing your history, learning the ideas and practices that connect you to the over 3,000 African traditions and struggles in the world. It is the deliberate act of learning Kemet and Kush, Aksum and Punt, Ifriqiya and Amazinga, Great Zimbabwe and the great kingdoms of West Africa, such as Ghana, Mali, and the Soso empires, for example. It is recreationally familiarizing ourselves with foundational texts on Africa and blackness. Beyond its theft of land and people, colonization colonized the mind. It taught us, peoples of African descent, to see ourselves through the eyes of those who dispossessed us. Frantz Fanon called this the colonized mind, the internalization of anti-blackness as a condition of self-perception. Consciousness is the antidote to Fanon's diagnosis because it destroys internalized anti-blackness. And Marcus Garvey once said, a people without knowledge of their history, origin, and culture are like a tree without roots. Consciousness is how we regrow our roots. Now say commitment.
Commitment.
Give it a little more, y'all. Commitment.
Commitment.
Now, if color is who we are, and consciousness is what we know, then commitment is what we do. Consciousness without commitment is just intellectual exercise. Instead of explaining commitment to Africa, let me give you in my humble opinion, the greatest example of commitment to Africa. On March 25th, 2026, this past Wednesday, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution A80L48, entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement as the greatest crime against humanity. This resolution names the systematic capture, trafficking, and enslavement of more than 12.5 million Africans by European powers as the gravest crime ever committed in world history. The resolution demands reparations. It demands the restitution of cultural artifacts. It recognizes that slavery's legacy persists through modern racial inequalities. Children of Africa from every corner of the globe stood together at the world stage and declared justice for Africa and her children all over the world. 123 nations voted in favor. Every one of Africa's 54 UN member states co-sponsored it. The nation with the most slave castles in the world, the Republic of Ghana, introduced it. The African Union and the Caribbean Community Organization, CARICOM, substantively drafted the resolution and lobbied it through the UN corridors. Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Venezuela co-sponsored the resolution as nations whose soil Britain and Spain used as laboratories for racialized violence, legalized slavery, and plantation economy. These countries have large populations of African descendants, children of Africa who share our color, our consciousness, and our commitment to a global community of Africa. Commitment to being African requires the daily practice of living those values, making choices that reflect the dignity and unity of African descendants, and actively building a future where all dispersed and continental Africans work and live together. Just as slavery employed business acumen to scale the plantation economy and triangular trade, and just as slavery invented inglorious legal maneuvers through contracts, codes, charters, taxes, and treaties to perpetuate the single worst crime in human history, Africa and her descendants mobilized those same instruments of law, business, and governance to compel the entire international legal order to condemn this crime, to strategize reparative justice, and to recognize slavery's living legacy in the corporal and spiritual memories of billions of children of Africa across the globe. Passage of UN Resolution A80L48 was an unprecedented instantiation of commitment. For the first time ever, 1.7 billion children of Africa translated color and consciousness into a declaration of global moral consensus. Every enforceable, binding legal norm the world has began as a declaration exactly like this one. The moral reckoning of our African ancestors demanded. African scholars named, and African lawyers and diplomats carried to the floor of the United Nations Assembly. That is commitment. Commitment is a progressive arc from identity, color, to knowledge, consciousness, to action, commitment. And the best part of intentionally being African and committing to global Africa is that commitment is just the beginning of a whole new world. Thank you.